It was supposed to be just another ordinary night. The house was silent. My parents had said goodbye with a cold kiss on the forehead and an automatic good night, as they always did. I slept soundly, unaware that, at that very moment, a pact of betrayal was about to be sealed right above my head. Literally, they waited for dawn like thieves on the prowl and entered my room like shadows. I didn't wake up. They had it all planned. My father held the scissors. My mother held my head, and together they cut my hair while I slept. They cut not just strands, but entire chunks of my identity. The sound of the scissors slicing through the air should have woken me, but it didn't. Exhaustion and trust left me vulnerable, and it was precisely this trust that they betrayed in the most despicable way possible, without looking me in the eyes, without explaining anything, without even giving me the right to understand. When I opened my eyes, it was still dawn. The pillow was covered in strands, and the air had that strange metallic smell that only cut hair has. For a second I thought I was dreaming, until I noticed the surprised look on my older sister's face, standing in the doorway. She tried to hide her laughter, but failed. That's when I understood. She knew. She was part of it too. What hurt me most wasn't the cut itself, but the coldness with which everyone was willing to pretend it was normal, as if forcibly cutting someone's hair wasn't a form of violence. My sister said, "It was for your own good. You looked ridiculous with that long hair." Her words stung more than any blade. My hair was an extension of my essence, of the little control I had over my body and my identity, and they took that away from me, as if they were pulling a weed. The justification came like a stab in the pride. "You'd ruin the wedding photos with that awful hair." That was it. The reason. I was ruining my sister's big day with my appearance. According to them, the cut wasn't an attack, but a necessary cosmetic adjustment. And the most disturbing thing? They said it matter-of-factly, as if they were doing me a favor. I, who had always been the quiet daughter, the one who swallowed her words and accepted orders, now had to swallow my tears too. Looking in the mirror that morning was like staring at a corpse. That wasn't me anymore. She was someone who had been invaded, erased, diminished by the very person who was supposed to protect her. How could I trust anyone after that? How could I go back to sleep knowing my own home had become a trap? I didn't tell anyone, out of shame, out of fear, out of that coerced silence every victim feels after abuse. My parents carried on as if nothing had happened. They forced me to smile in the photos, to wear the dress my sister chose, to pretend I was still part of it all. But I wasn't. I was the outsider, the one forcibly molded to fit into a scenario I didn't want to be a part of. The cut hurt, but it hurt even more knowing it was done by the hands of the ones I trusted most. They didn't use harsh words. They didn't hit me. They didn't yell at me. But silent violence, the kind that comes disguised as care, leaves the deepest scars. Their betrayal was silent, but it echoed within me. That day, something was born inside me, a cold, silent, and profound rage. It wasn't explosive fury. It was something more dangerous. It was the kind of pain that ferments, that grows hidden, that matures silently until it's ready to be released. I didn't want revenge right away. I hadn't planned anything there, but I promised myself one thing: I would never forget. I would let them believe they had won, that they had silenced me, that they had molded me into the image they desired. But deep down, every cut thread would be a reminder. Every forced smile I gave would be preparation. They didn't know it, but by cutting me that night, they not only betrayed me, they awakened me. I remember exactly the moment I looked in the mirror for the first time. The shock didn't come immediately. For a few seconds, my mind couldn't accept what my eyes saw. It was as if my reflection had been replaced by someone else, someone smaller, diminished, erased. My hair, the one I'd cared for so lovingly since I was a teenager, was gone. It was left in uneven, short pieces, a deliberate disaster. I touched my head with trembling hands and felt the rough texture of the poorly cut uneven ends. The sensation was naked, as if my identity had been ripped away. In that moment, something collapsed inside me. I didn't cry out loud, just a tear fell. And it burned like acid. What they did to me wasn't a simple makeover. It was a mutilation, a punishment, a cruel reminder that, in that house, I had no voice. At breakfast, the humiliation took on a bitter taste. My parents acted normally, as if they hadn't invaded my body during the night. My sister giggled every time she looked at me. And me, I tried to swallow the bread, the juice, the shame. Every word they said felt like mockery, a provocation. The table was set, but the atmosphere was rotten. Everything was appearance, everything was an act, and I was the spectacle. When I stood up, my mother casually commented, "Now you look presentable. You'll even look like a real person in photos." My stomach churned. I didn't respond. My silence was the only shield I had left, but inside I screamed. I begged for this to be a nightmare. Only it wasn't. It was real, and it was even worse than I could have imagined. At school, it was even worse. The stares, the whispers, the giggles in the hallways. No one knew what had happened, but everyone knew something was wrong. A teacher even asked if I'd cut my hair at home, and I could only respond with a shy nod. I didn't have the courage to tell her. How could I tell her? How could I explain that I'd been betrayed by my own parents? Who would believe me? It was easier to think I was just a rebellious teenager who decided to change her style overnight. But it wasn't rebellion. It was forced submission. I hid in the bathrooms during recess. I cried in the dark. Every comment I heard made me shrink further. I felt small, insignificant, a walking shame. The physical pain of the cut was non-existent, but the emotional pain, that was unbearable. Social media was the final blow. My sister posted a photo with the caption, "Emergency makeover done with love. Sometimes we need scissors to save other people's self-esteem." The comments were a mix of laughter and applause. Some said I was better off this way. Others laughed at the situation. I read every word with burning eyes. This wasn't just exposure. It was a public mockery. She didn't just participate in the humiliation. She broadcast it to the world. I became a meme within my own family. Meanwhile, my parents liked the post as if they approved of everything. It was as if I were just a dysfunctional accessory in the perfect life they wanted to sell. And the worst part? They were winning. It was in that moment, seeing the likes, the comments, and my sister's satisfied smile on the screen, that something began to change inside me. It wasn't just pain, it was something deeper, a desire to reclaim what had been taken from me, an internal scream that said, "They won't get away with it." The humiliation broke me, yes, but it would also rebuild me. Because behind every mocking laugh, every snide comment, every look of contempt, I hid a promise. One day, they would be ashamed, not just of me, but of themselves. The anger didn't come all at once. It built in layers, like a dark painting that covered every inch of my soul. Every time I looked in the mirror, the reflection wasn't just of a poorly cut hair, it was a reflection of my powerlessness, my suppressed pain, my stifled voice. Each stray lock reminded me that I'd been disrespected in my own home, that those who should have loved me unconditionally chose to use me as a platform for another daughter's vanity. I tried to move on, but it was impossible to forget. It was like an invisible scar that burned every time someone brought up the subject, even unintentionally. A single comment about hair, appearance, or self-esteem was enough to reignite the fire, and this fire began to shape me in ways I didn't even recognize. I stopped smiling. I became quieter, more observant, colder. People around me noticed, but no one asked what was going on. My parents pretended everything was normal. My sister continued the wedding preparations as if she were living a fairy tale. I was the ghost in the middle of the party, but unlike ghosts who haunt out of pain, I was already beginning to haunt out of strategy. I knew something inside me was changing. It wasn't just suffering, it was calculation, a plan that was taking shape within my silence. Each day that passed, each fake smile they gave, each time they ignored or mocked me, was like a brick being laid in the foundation of something bigger, my revenge. I began to record conversations, photograph documents, read everything I could about rights, about invasion of privacy, about family manipulation. Yes, I knew none of it would give me back what I'd lost, but what I could do was build new ground on the rubble. Anger, once uncontrolled and painful, was now my ally. And with it, I didn't just want answers. I wanted justice. Not the formal, cold and impersonal justice of the law, but the poetic justice that corrects twisted narratives, the kind that exposes false moralism, the kind that tears away the masks of those hiding behind familiar smiles. I was no longer the victim. I was the clock that was silently counting down the minutes to their collapse. Sometimes when we were all together in the living room, my mother would say things like, "We only wanted the best for you." And my father would say, "You needed that change. You'll thank us one day." I just watched, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth, because I already knew that thank you was coming, just not in the way they imagined. It was ironic. While they celebrated the approaching wedding of their favorite daughter, believing everything was perfect, I sharpened my weapons. And my weapon was the truth they buried with scissors and laughter, the truth that would soon be spat in their faces in front of everyone who cared most about appearances. There wasn't a single day that went by that I didn't remember the early morning hours of my betrayal. Sometimes I woke to the imaginary sound of scissors echoing in the darkness. Other times, I felt chills just lying on the same pillow. But instead of running away from these memories, I began to use them, revisit them, feed on them, because I understood that the most powerful revenge isn't born of rage but of patience, of memory, and of pain that transforms into purpose. And my purpose was clear: to show everyone who they really were, to expose the carefully crafted lie, to tear down the altar of appearances they'd built at my expense, and to do it in a way that would never be forgotten. The big day finally arrived. My sister's wedding was announced with pomp, luxury, and ostentation. The house was decorated like a fake castle, covered in expensive flowers and even faker smiles. My parents walked around like royalty, welcoming guests, smiling, giving hugs, and feigning a harmony that never existed. I watched everything silently, like a stranger infiltrated in my own blood. Every detail of that ceremony was meant to cover up the rot that existed behind our family facade. The guests saw a united, loving, happy family, but I knew, I remembered. I carried within me the truth that would soon transform that entire celebration into a minefield. My sister looked radiant. She wore a custom-made white dress, the kind that shimmers in the sunlight. But to me, that glow was plastic, almost cynical, because behind the veil, the makeup, and the vows of eternal love was the same girl who laughed at my pain, the same girl who portrayed my humiliation as a public joke, the same girl who manipulated my parents into destroying me in the name of good aesthetic taste. And there she was, acting out perfection for everyone, unaware that the play was about to turn into a tragedy. I saw her looking at herself in the mirror, smiling contentedly, believing everything was under control. And that made me even more certain that the turning point needed to be there, at the altar, center stage, before the audience that so admired this farce. During lunch, while the guests toasted and laughed, I kept to myself. Dressed discreetly with a hairstyle that hid the remnants of the traumatic cut, I blended into the scene without attracting attention. But inside, every step was rehearsed. Every smile I gave was meticulously calculated. I was in control. The pain that had suffocated me weeks ago was now fuel. While everyone celebrated, I watched. I waited. Because it wasn't just about revenge, it was about choosing the right moment, where every eye would be focused on them, where the fall was inevitable and the impact irreversible. After all, what stage could be more symbolic than the wedding that destroyed my identity? My parents circulated among the guests, glasses in hand, proud as if presenting an award. They talked about sacrifices, about how they educated with love and firmness. I wanted to laugh or scream, but I controlled myself, because every word they said only fueled the bomb I was about to explode. In their minds, everything had been resolved. The rebellious daughter had gone silent. The other was getting married. The family image was preserved. Little did they know that the same silent daughter was about to rewrite history. I could feel the nervousness rising in the air. It was like electricity before a storm. And that storm would have a name, a date, a time, and an address. The main hall for the ceremony, where everyone would be gathered. Then came the speech. The microphone was passed from hand to hand. First the groom's parents, then his friends, and finally my parents. My mother gave an emotional speech, feigning tears that didn't exist. My father spoke of the pride of seeing the family growing. My sister smiled as if she were the queen of the world. And then unexpectedly, or rather strategically planned, the microphone was offered to me. They expected a generic speech, a thank you, a compliment to the bride. But what they received was an earthquake. And it all began with a single sentence. I also have something to say about this family. The silence was immediate, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be asked. All it took was my voice filling the room with that phrase. I also have something to say about this family. And the atmosphere, previously filled with laughter and toasts, plunged into a tension that could have been cut with a knife. Everyone looked at me, some curious, others uncomfortable. My parents glanced at each other nervously. My sister frowned, trying to maintain a smile as if thinking she couldn't do it. But I was, and more than capable. I was ready. My time had come. I walked to the center of the room, received the microphone with steady hands and took a deep breath. This wasn't just any outburst. It was the final act of a pain built in silence, and there was no going back. Today is the day everyone celebrates love, unity, the beauty of a family. But what happens when that beauty is built on someone's pain? I began, looking into my mother's eyes. She froze. My father cleared his throat, crossing his arms. My sister smiled nervously, trying to maintain control, and the guests began to fidget. I continued. I told her about the early morning when they cut my hair while I slept. I told her it was a joint decision made by the people who were supposed to protect me. I said in no uncertain terms that it was humiliation disguised as care, and I looked directly at my sister as I said, "You didn't want a sister, you wanted an ornament for your wedding. And when you realized I didn't fit into your perfect setting, you decided to forcibly transform me." The reactions were immediate. Murmurs, whispers, eyes meeting. Some people seemed shocked, others looked at my parents waiting for an answer. But I wasn't finished. I grabbed my phone and connected it to the salon's big screen, and there, in front of everyone, I showed my sister's messages to my mother. "That hair of hers is going to ruin everything. Find a way, for God's sake, even if it has to be forced." And my mother replied, "Don't worry, she'll wake up a new person." Those words echoed like a punch. I also showed the post mocking me with my own parents' comments and likes, and each revelation was like a nail being hammered into the coffin of the image they'd tried to preserve for so long. The mask began to crack, and no one could hide anything anymore. My sister tried to interrupt me, claiming I was exaggerating, that it was just a haircut. But the faces around me were no longer on her side. People began to rise from their chairs. Some whispered among themselves. Others stared at the family as if seeing monsters for the first time. I looked around and realized they were seeing. They were finally seeing. And in that moment, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all the people who had ever been silenced for the sake of appearances. I was exposing the pattern, the sham, the dirt hidden under the carpet of good manners. The entire room became an arena where the truth was impossible to ignore, and every second was a victory over years of oppression. The most symbolic thing was my mother's look. She said nothing, but her eyes pleaded for silence, for mercy. But I didn't give it, because in that moment, I was the voice she tried to silence. I was the image she wanted to erase, and most importantly, I was the consequence of her choices. As my sister walked away furious and my father tried to calm things down with empty words, I calmly finished. A real family doesn't cut its children into frames. A real family welcomes, listens, protects, but you chose to mold me by force. Now, live with the consequences. And I handed back the microphone. The party, which had seemed like a fairy tale, had become a documentary about the truth, and I was the director of this story. It wasn't impulsive. Nothing there was done in the heat of emotion. My revenge wasn't a scream, it was silence. It wasn't fury, it was strategy. I spent weeks, maybe months, planning each step with surgical precision. While they were busy with guest lists, flower selections, and elaborate menus, I was immersed in something much more important, restoring my dignity. My every move was calculated. I knew that to truly dismantle their act, I couldn't appear bitter. I needed to appear firm. I couldn't appear emotional, I had to appear logical. It wasn't enough to vent. I had to expose myself, point out the facts, show proof. And that's how I pieced it all together. Screenshots, archived messages, audio recordings, public comments, small pieces of a puzzle that together formed the true picture of my family. The wedding was just the stage, but the construction of revenge began long before. I scheduled meetings, recorded phone calls, and provoked small situations to extract what I needed, all without arousing suspicion. It wasn't about creating a scandal. It was about achieving justice. A justice that doesn't come from court, but from conscious exposure. My sister constructed a princess narrative, the perfect bride, the beloved daughter, the successful woman. I merely revealed what lay beneath the veneer, a selfish, manipulative, and cruel person. The cruelest part? She never imagined I would have the courage to speak out. She counted on my silence, on my shame. And it was precisely this trust that brought her down. Because while she walked down the aisle, thinking she was the center of the world, I held in my hands the truth that would destroy the castle of lies. My parents were also key players in executing the plan. They thought they had defeated me, that their weak daughter had backed down, given up. and resigned herself. But what they didn't know is that the silence they so celebrated was the same one that was guarding their downfall. I knew where and how to hit them, their reputation. Friends from church, distant relatives, co-workers, everyone was there. They all watched live the crumbling of the image my parents had built over decades. I didn't need to raise my voice or invent anything. I simply revealed it. I did what they always feared. I showed the world who they were when they thought no one was looking. And that for them was infinitely more destructive than any cry of revolt. And even after everything was revealed, my stance remained unwavering. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I didn't apologize. I just let the facts speak for themselves. Revenge, for me, wasn't about making them suffer what I suffered. It was about making everyone see that behind the perfect family rhetoric, there were silent aggressors, that not all violence screams. That sometimes it comes in the form of scissors, suppressed laughter, forced touches. The justice I wanted wasn't physical, it was symbolic, and it was fulfilled the moment my mother lowered her eyes, my father left the room, and my sister burst into tears in front of the cameras she herself hired. If there was any shred of doubt in me, it vanished in that instant. I wasn't cruel. I was fair. I didn't retaliate in kind. I responded intelligently. My revenge didn't just destroy a day, it destroyed an entire farce. And more than that, it gave me back my freedom, the right to walk with my head held high, to look in the mirror without feeling erased, to breathe without apologizing for existing. And that no one could take from me. They had always counted on silence, on the fact that in public, no one would dare confront them. The mask of exemplary parents and model daughter was maintained so zealously that few dared doubt it. But in that ballroom, packed with well-dressed people and armed smiles, every glance became a mirror. And these mirrors, for the first time, didn't reflect the plastic beauty they had so cultivated. They reflected horror, shame, disbelief. The audience, previously captive and complicit, became witness to the downfall. Not coincidentally, the most impactful part of the revelation was precisely the moment I stopped speaking. The silence that filled the room was heavy. That silence that says more than any words. There was nowhere to hide, there was no sufficient distraction, because what everyone saw, no one could unsee. Some guests lowered their eyes, embarrassed. Others stared at my parents with disgust. Some whispered among themselves, clearly trying to reassemble what they had just heard. But the most symbolic thing was seeing the best men and bridesmaids, those wearing matching outfits, the ones chosen to represent the couple's perfection, completely unresponsive. They were paralyzed, like statues in mid-collapse. They were part of the narrative, part of the show, but the show had shifted gears and now the plot was different. Instead of celebration, there was judgment. Instead of celebration, there was discomfort. And all of this was transmitted in real time by the attentive eyes of the audience. Every expression, every sigh, every hesitant step. They became jurors in an invisible courtroom, and the verdict was clear. Truth had won. The poor groom looked at my sister as if he were seeing a stranger. Maybe I never realized how far she was capable of going. Maybe I ignored the signs. Maybe, like me, you believed too much in the fake smile. But now he knew, and so did the audience. When the truths came out, there was no room for excuses or for emotional manipulation. Everything was laid bare, and it's curious how shame, when it's collective, weighs more heavily. My parents tried to maintain their composure, but their expressions betrayed their desperation. My father's old charisma silently faded. My mother's obsessive control slipped by the second. And my sister was no longer the bride. She was the woman everyone watched with a mixture of pity and contempt. I didn't need to shout to be heard. My presence was enough, my posture, my calm tone, my clarity. All of it contrasted with the emotional chaos that had set in. While my tormentors tried to understand where they'd lost control, I stood firm, because in that moment I was everything they couldn't stop me from being. Strong, lucid, true. And the most powerful thing was seeing in the audience's eyes that, for the first time, someone had done what many wanted to do but never could. Break the pact of silence that sustains toxic families. It didn't matter if some might think it was excessive. It didn't matter if others would remain silent out of convenience. The truth had been told, and the embarrassment was living proof that she'd hit the mark. And so, what was supposed to be a wedding became a spectacle of justice. Not the cold justice of the courts, but the justice of the gaze, of spontaneous judgment, of exposing the truth before those who mattered most to them, the society they admired, the friends they wanted to impress, the relatives they flattered. The audience saw it all, and in seeing they became accomplices in a new cycle, that of liberation. Because from that day forward, no matter how much they tried to wash the blood from their hands, no matter how much they feigned remorse, no matter how much they reconstructed the narrative, there would always be someone who remembered, who saw, who witnessed. And this collective memory is the most enduring revenge of all. The scissors that cut my hair while I slept were silent, but what I took with me to the altar of revenge was much sharper. Words. My voice, which they tried to erase with cuts and shame, returned like a blade, but not a violent or uncontrolled blade. It was sharp as a scalpel, precise, surgical, fatal. When I opened my mouth in that hall and began to recount, calmly and in rich detail, everything they had done, no scream could compare to the impact of my words. The strength of my narrative lay in the truth and in the courage to tell it. Each word carried a wound, but also a healing. Each comma was an act of rebellion. Each silence between one sentence and the next was louder than any music at the party. I used the same expressions my sister had used to mock me. I repeated her words with the same cold intonation she'd used. I said, in front of everyone, "It was for your own good," as she'd said to me that morning. And then with my eyes fixed on her, I replied, "Funny, because looking at you now, I feel like maybe it was you who needed a change, but not in your hair, in your character." The room fell silent. I saw a few mouths open in astonishment. The bride paled. The word "there" was crueler than any blow, because words have a memory, and when spoken truthfully, they need no reinforcement. They enter through the ears and settle like an internal mirror, forcing each person to look at themselves. I didn't stop there. I turned to my parents and said, "You cut my hair," claiming to protect me. But who protects a daughter while she sleeps, or while she cries in silence? You didn't protect me. You silenced me. And then, looking directly at the guests, I added, "They never hit me, but they took from me something that hurts more than a slap, the freedom to be who I am." This wasn't just a denunciation, it was a liberation, a return. And the more I spoke, the more they shrank. The words began to take on physical weight. Their shoulders hunched, their eyes shifted, their hands trembled. Because they knew that my every sentence was an exposed scar, and a scar when exposed becomes proof. My speech wasn't long, but it was precise. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to cry. I used the same tone they always used with me, firm, direct, impassive. But unlike them, I spoke truthfully. I wasn't afraid of being judged. I had already been judged in silence for years. Now it was their turn. My word was justice, and also healing. It was a warning, and also a sentence. And above all, it was a living reminder of what many pretend doesn't happen in respectable families. I said what needed to be said. Did it hurt them? Yes, it was meant to, because it hurt me for far too long. The difference is that my pain was hidden, and now theirs was public. And that's why I say don't underestimate the power of words. They can rebuild or destroy. They can liberate or imprison. And that day I transformed them into a sword that didn't physically wound but opened wounds that bleed silently. Because when the truth is spoken, firmly and courageously, it doesn't need an echo. It spreads on its own. And they would hear my voice for a long time, even when the hall was empty. After the last word, there was no applause. There was no music. There wasn't even that nervous laughter people let out when they don't know what to do. There was just silence. A dense, paralyzing, almost suffocating silence. It was as if the air had shifted in weight within the room. No one dared move. No one knew where to look. The DJ, who was about to start the next song of the party, froze with his finger on the button. The waiters stopped circulating. The guests, once so excited, seemed like living statues, trapped between shock and embarrassment. The wedding had frozen in time. And in that vacuum of sound, in that collective void, there was a deafening noise, the truth echoing. My sister stood motionless. The fiancé beside her didn't know whether to comfort her or turn away. He seemed torn between love and revulsion. My mother, her hands trembling in her lap, kept her eyes fixed on the floor as if each tile hid an emergency exit that never appeared. My father stared fixedly ahead, as if, by denying the present, he could return to the past. But it was too late. The damage was done. And there, at the epicenter of the collapse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time, peace, because their silence was the greatest cry of defeat I could hear. The absence of words, for those who have always had control, is a sentence. And now there was no justification that could save them. Everything they said would ring false, because the truth spoken with courage silences even the most arrogant. Some guests began to leave, not in a stampede, but in a silent, uncomfortable exodus. Some simply lowered their heads and headed toward the door. Others whispered, "I'm sorry," as they passed me, their looks mixing empathy and shame. The ballroom that had been carefully decorated to resemble a fairy tale was now the stage for a moral tragedy. And like every good tragedy, there was a lesson. A wedding that was supposed to seal the union of a family was transformed there into a watershed. No one would leave that party the same way they entered, not the guests, and certainly not my family. Public shame has a bitter taste, but it's fair. My parents always worried about what others will think, and that day, finally, others thought, and saw, and judged. The weight of other people's judgment, which they had always used to control, now fell upon them with double the intensity. And the worst part? There was no way to erase it. There was no way to pretend it hadn't happened. The words had been spoken, the evidence had been shown, the reactions had been witnessed, and the silence that hung there was like a monument to the truth they had tried to hide for so long. It was as if everyone had been hypnotized by the beauty of their appearance, until the truth painfully awakened them. And in that moment, amidst the collective embarrassment, I learned a powerful lesson. Sometimes, you don't need to make noise to be heard. You don't need violent revenge to achieve justice. Their silence, forced, ashamed, humiliated, was confirmation that my pain was not in vain, and that my voice had finally broken the cycle. Because in that silence, there was no more control, there were no more excuses, there were only consequences, and those who silenced my identity with scissors were now silenced by the truth they never expected to face. The same room where I was forced to pose beside them, weeks before the wedding with a forced smile and mangled hair, was now the setting where the truth finally found its echo. The place where they tried to erase me became the stage for my ascension. This is what poetic justice is. Not noisy revenge, but the restored order where it all began. It was in that same space before the same witnesses that my dignity was restored. And even more symbolically, not by anyone's hands, but by my own words. I didn't need a savior, I didn't need allies, I just needed my voice. The one they tried to silence with laughter, control, and shame. And it finally spoke louder than any wedding song. The irony was cutting. My sister, who had been so concerned with the aesthetics of the ceremony, ended the day with her makeup smeared from crying and her dress wrinkled from anguish. My parents, who had planned an event to be admired, left under the cruelest gazes, those of disappointment, because nothing is more devastating for those who live by appearances than being publicly exposed. And the cruelest thing, they had no one to blame but themselves. I had merely shown what they had done. I had only shed light on what they had tried to hide in the shadows. And light, when it arrives, burns. It illuminates the dirt. It reveals what has been swept under expensive rugs. It is uncomfortable and necessary. And it was this light that transformed their most important day into the day I was reborn. I won't lie, there was a moment when I thought about giving up, about accepting that time would erase the pain. But the truth is, some wounds only heal when justice is served, and not just any justice, but the kind that restores balance, that breaks the cycle of emotional impunity, that restores what was coldly taken from us. Seeing each of them face the consequences of their own actions was the perfect end to a bitter cycle. And even if they try to undo the damage, rebuild reputations, invent versions, the truth is already planted. And the audience, the same one that once applauded the farce, now knows the truth, and this truth will always be a shadow that will follow them in each new attempt at a new beginning. I walked out of the hall with firm steps, for the first time in a long time, without slouching, without avoiding eyes, without hiding within myself. It was as if, finally, I was whole again, not because I had won a battle against them, but because I had won the internal war against the fear, shame, and guilt I had carried for so long. I freed myself on the same stage where I was wounded. This is poetic justice. They chose to cut me in the dark. I chose to illuminate them before everyone. And the biggest difference between us is this. While they still live hostage to appearances, I remain free, sustained by the truth. And if you, who are watching this story, have ever felt silenced, humiliated, diminished by those who should protect you, know this. Your pain doesn't have to be eternal. You can transform it. You can choose not only to survive, but to rebuild yourself. with truth, with courage, with dignity. Because justice is not revenge, justice is balance. It's the return of what was forcibly taken from you. It's the moment when you stop asking for permission to exist and begin to occupy your space firmly. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Have you ever had to keep quiet to keep the peace? Let's open this space so other voices can be heard. Here, no one cuts anyone off in the dark anymore.